Welcome to the final lesson of the course, Unit 6 Federalism, Topic 6.2 Local Governments. Congratulations, you made it through the course almost. You got this lesson, then you got a couple more assignments in the next class, a final exam, and then you're done. So by the end of these notes, you should be able to describe the different services provided by local governments. So that's right, we're finally getting to that point. We spent the entire course pretty much talking exclusively about the federal government. We've talked a little bit about the states, and here's the one lesson I'm going to give you on local governments. This is the beginning of your lessons. This is not the end of it. You should always continue to go on, explore, learn more on your own, but this is just an introduction to local governments and their importance. So begs the question, what are local governments? They're just smaller governments that govern a smaller geographic region or district. The organization names used by these governments, they vary a lot from state to state. So, for instance, some use the term counties. Right? Each state, like Wisconsin, is divided up into smaller counties. Louisiana calls them parishes, but here in Wisconsin, we call them counties. The state of Wisconsin, in particular, is divided up among 72 counties. Counties have their own elected officials with their own responsibilities and powers. In Wisconsin, each of the 72 counties has a legislative branch known as a county board, an executive branch known as a county executive, and a county court system as well. Within the counties are towns and cities. So these are small towns. So the bigger the population, we call them cities. And then towns and cities also have their own elected officials as well. And these elected officials have their own individual responsibilities. They have a legislative branch, a lot of times referred to as a common council, an executive branch known as the mayor, and they also have municipal or city courts. And then there are school districts. The state government makes many general laws about schools, but a lot of the decisions are actually left to local elected officials like myself. School districts have a legislative branch known as the school board, an executive branch with the superintendent, and there are judicial functions that are actually handled within the executive and legislative branches jointly. So schools don't really have a separate judicial branch. Instead, the legislative and executive branches share the judicial powers. Some school districts, like Cudahy or St. Francis, each cover the geographic region of their respective municipality. A municipality is just a local city or town. It's a fancy name that covers cities and towns. Others cover multiple municipalities, like the Oak Creek Franklin Joint School District. Now, Cudahy and St. Francis may one day merge due to neither having enough money or students to survive independently, but right now they are separate entities with their own separate legal bodies. So, if the federal government gets its powers from the federal constitution and the state governments get their powers from the state constitutions and the federal constitution, where do local governments get their powers from? Well, they have two sources. The first is the constituents who elect them. The second is from charters from the state government, which authorizes them to use some of the reserved powers of the states. So only state governments can create municipalities and special districts within a state. That's something that the federal government says the states have the power to do, not the federal government. And because the local municipalities are essentially extensions of the state government, the state governments are also able to change or take over local governments if they believe they're not living up to their responsibilities. In essence, what this means is that if the state of Wisconsin feels the city of Cudahy isn't doing a good enough job managing the people of Cudahy, then the state can just get rid of our common council and mayor and directly control the city of Cudahy. They could also do the same thing for a school district. If they feel that the Cudahy School District is not doing a good enough job to educate students, they could get rid of the elected school board and the legislature can directly manage the schools of the city of Cudahy. Every few years you hear this going on with the state legislature is considering doing this with the city of Milwaukee and the school district of Milwaukee. Now, there are federal districts. Congress can create special districts outside of the 50 states. So an example of this would be Washington, D.C., with D.C. being short for the District of Columbia. It is a special municipal district that exists outside the boundaries of any given state. It's actually not within Virginia or Maryland. It's a separate federal entity that is controlled by Congress. And D.C. is controlled directly by Congress, but in previous decades, they've allowed the District of Columbia to have more, self-rule and home rule to have some elected bodies to make decisions for themselves, although the current Congress and president is talking about taking that away from DC. The reason why the DC is not part of any given state is because if it was within a state, that would give a single state control over the physical location of the seat of power of the federal government, giving them more power over the federal government. So, what exactly do local governments do then? That's a great question. They do pretty much everything you think of when you think of government. They decide the credit requirements for graduation. They decide which textbooks can be used in the classrooms. They manage garbage collection and storage. They maintain clean drinking water for their municipalities. They maintain and manage fire and police departments. They run our local library systems. In some areas, they even manage utilities like electricity and water. They run local transportation systems like the Milwaukee County Transit System, which runs our buses, or they even run some regional airports. Heck, they fix the potholes in the roads that you drive over in order to get to school every day. Or at least they're supposed to. So if they do all these things, how do they pay for these services? Well, the main way they do that is what's called the property tax. This is money people or businesses pay on land and buildings they own inside the county. So you might own your property outright. You don't have any loans or anything like that. You just own the property outright. You still have to pay a tax to the local government every year based on how much that property is worth. And if you don't, if you don't pay enough years in a row, then the local government will seize your property and then they will sell it in order to recoup the taxes that you owe, and then they'll give you the amount that's remaining. Another source of their income comes from what's known as a sales tax. This is the amount of money added to the cost of a product or service when you buy something and goes to the government instead of the company. It's why when you go to the store and you see something that says $19.99 on the shelf, but then when you go to the register, they charge you $21.11 for it. Well, that extra dollar or so is actually the tax that goes to the government, whereas the $19.99 goes to the business. Then governments also have fees. This is money paid for services that the county provides. For example, a county might provide garbage collection, but you have to pay a fee for it to help support that service. If you don't have garbage collection on your property, then you don't have to pay the fee because you're not using the service. This is why, for instance, schools sometimes will charge you an athletic fee for playing on a sports team, right? If you're not on the team, you don't have to pay the fee, but if you're using the service of that team, well, then you have to pay an extra fee because, well, you're using the service. Then state and federal governments also share some money with their local governments with conditions attached. So local governments don't have direct access to income taxes, which is where most taxes come from. That money gets shared with local governments if the state or federal governments agree to give them some of what they've collected. So essentially, local governments are dependent on state and federal governments to get a share of those income taxes to pay for services that the people need. If you look here, you can see what our money is actually spent on. So the City of Cudahy's 2024 budget here, we notice that the vast majority of it, over half of that money, comes from local property taxes. The next highest chunk right here comes from what's known as intergovernmental. So that's revenue that's shared with the city from the state or federal level, with the next highest being known as other financing sources. So this can be any number of other things. And then you see these smaller slivers here coming from fines like speeding tickets, public charges, so those are fees. Investment, a very small amount, about $90,000, comes from income from investing. And then you see a chunk from license and permits as well for business licenses, liquor licenses, things like that. If you look at what we spend that money on, the overwhelming majority of it is on public safety. That's right. Then you have public works right here, the third highest. General government is here. But what you don't see here is education, because the education budget is actually separate from the city budget. Because remember, the city of Cudahy is one local government. The school district of Cudahy is actually a separate government, which gets its own tax revenue from property taxes. Now, what's important to know is most local governments get most of their money from property taxes. The higher the value of the property within the local government's region, the more money they can collect in property taxes to spend on the services that the people want. However, people also want really low property taxes because they don't like giving money to the government. So there's this battle of people wanting the service but not wanting to pay for it. and that's the eternal battle that all politicians must fight. That's it. You've reached the very end of the very last notes for this class. Congratulations. You have 1 day worth of lessons left. Hopefully, we have time for at least 1 day of review, and then the final exam. You pass the class, you get the credit, you get marked off for your graduation requirement, and you're good to go. But before you do that, one last time, rewrite today's goal. Identify 3 important facts from the notes that help you show you understand that goal, and then that one last final question you get to ask me related to the topic of the course. Of course, you can ask me in class tomorrow or whenever you see me next, but this is the last time I'm going to have you write it out. All right? I'll see you when I see you. Maybe.